So very early on in the course, when I first introduced let and const, I talked about how const does not allow for reassignment, right? And with what we knew at the time, we could do things like const pi equals 3.14159 or whatever our sequences for pi. And that makes sense because this should never change. It's always the same. And that's why we're using const, right? If I try and do something like pi plus equals 1, I get an error. But then I also mentioned, once we get to things like arrays and eventually objects, we'll see that const has other uses. And now that we're dealing with arrays, let's talk about that. So in the previous video, we talked about how variables really refer to, there's a reference to an array, sort of an address. And it's not the contents necessarily that are stored in the variable itself. Unlike with a primitive, where things are a lot simpler and they take up a finite amount of space, an array could grow to some obscene size, or it could be very small. So it all has to do with these references, and I use this idea of arrows pointing. So when I make an array, we actually can use const, and it's really common to do that because we can still change the contents of our array. What const cares about is that the variable itself is not reassigned. So when we store an array using const, let's do const, just nice and easy numbers. Nums equals 1, 2, 3, right? What I'm storing with nums is not the contents, it is a reference. So as long as that reference to the array does not change, think of it this way, if the shell remains the same, the contents can change. I could delete everything in here. I could add 1,000 new numbers, or I could just change the order. I could reverse it entirely. None of that impacts the address of this array, the reference. So there's an arrow pointing from nums to this. So I can do things like nums dot push 4. And it changes. I don't get an error. Unlike with a primitive like a number, when I use const and I try and reassign or update that variable, there's a big problem. I can't do it. With an array, we're in the clear as long as I'm changing the content. So in this example, my eggs equals the array brown, brown. I have 2 brown eggs in my carton. As long as this arrow pointing to the carton, which is our array, as long as that stays the same, I can do whatever I want. I can push on a new egg. I can change one of the eggs at the beginning, change the color, reassign the value in the array. But as soon as I try and set my eggs to something entirely different, a new reference, we get an error. So if I try to do, nums equals 1, well, that's clearly a reassignment. I'm going from an array to a number. Can't do that. But I also can't do this. Nums equals, let's just take a look at what nums is. 1, 2, 3, 4. I can't do this. Nums equals 1, 2, 3, 4. Why? Well, as we saw previously, this makes a brand new array. Completely different in JavaScript's eyes from the one that's currently in nums. They look the same to us, they have the same contents, but they are different in memory. So I get an error. And this is generally something we want if we're working with arrays. We want to be able to rely on the fact that our container will remain the same, right? If we have a list of chat messages we need to respond to, or let's say we're making a customer service app where we have, a queue of people we need to reply to, and we want to be able to sort them and order them. I want that queue to always be there. It might be empty. It might have 1,000 entries if it's a busy day, but I don't want to be able to just reassign that to something else entirely. I don't want to be able to set it to, false or null or something. I want it to always have that same shell, that same reference to the array, and then the contents can change. So it's just a safer way of working with arrays. You don't have to use it, but just keep in mind that it behaves differently than you might expect based off of what we've seen with const so far. Const with just a primitive, you can't change it at all. Const with an array, or as we'll see with objects, you can't change the reference, you cannot reassign, but you can alter the insides as much as you want. Get an interior decorator and completely renovate the interior, but that exterior, that shell is still the same.